Running from Bondage tells the story of enslaved women who escaped or who attempted to escape bondage during the era of the American Revolutionary War, a time period when chaos of war and lack of oversight made the escape of Black women possible in both the North and South. In fact, one-third of fugitives were enslaved women. My book consists of 5 chapters that explain why and how enslaved women escaped bondage and the various circumstances that they faced over the course of 5 decades from 1770 to the 1810s. I first unpack enslaved women's labor during the colonial period and their resistance strategies, and then take a deep dive into examining the escape of individual women. And what my book underscores is that enslaved women were not one-dimensional figures, but lived multidimensional lives as wives, mothers, sisters, and freedom fighters. And running away was easier during the colonial period than it was during the antebellum period because over time, white society grew more adept at tracking and capturing runaway slaves, particularly following the Revolutionary War. And of course, despite the limitations placed on enslaved women, they were able to contest their bondage through the liminal spaces of slavery. The pronouncement of Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775 and the Philipsburg Proclamation in 1779, offering freedom to escaped slaves, led to the escape of thousands of enslaved women and men. Researching my first book introduced me to women who escaped bondage either alone or with their family members during the late 18th century. This led me to question how widespread was the flight of enslaved women. My research led me to the Revolutionary War, which, according to historian Benjamin Quarles, was the first large-scale slave rebellion in American history. So I wanted to tell the stories of these women who escaped or who attempted to escape bondage during the Revolutionary era. I began this study 5 years ago, and the research for this study led me to the realization that there is so much more that historians can uncover in the lives of enslaved women. Although the evidence is fragmented, the experiences of fugitive women are far from unknowable. I used Latham Windley's 4-volume Runaway Slave Advertisements, a documentary history, as well as other published sources such as Don Hagest, Wives, Slaves, and Servant Girls. Both of these sources reproduce runaway slave advertisements. Although there is a great deal of abolitionist literature on enslaved people who escaped during the 1800s, the accounts of runaways during the 1700s are limited to colonial newspaper advertisements. So, in addition to colonial newspaper advertisements, I used an interview with George Washington's escaped slave owner judge, as well as trial records of fugitive slaves. There are thousands of runaway slave newspaper advertisements that are published and readily available, and trial records of fugitive slaves are available in state and university archives, so the sources for this study were readily available to me. Each fugitive slave advertisement is a valuable piece of research because it reveals the agency of enslaved women who, despite facing formidable obstacles, risked everything, including their lives, for freedom. Each advertisement tells the story of a real person, not an abstraction, and when further research is undertaken in other sources, real human beings begin to emerge from the records. We don't know the fate of the majority of the individuals named in the advertisements, but despite these limitations, a remarkable amount of information can be obtained about women caught up in a horrific system of bondage. What makes this book important for now and for future generations is that instead of seeing Black women at the margins of the American Revolution and abolitionism, it is important to see them as self-determined figures, and visible participants who put their lives on the line for freedom. They protested with their feet by running away, which underscores the vital role of women, Black women, in seeking to move the nation forward toward a more perfect union. My book also dispels the idea that Black women did not flee or attempt to flee bondage during the Revolutionary era. Black women have been an essential part of the long war against slavery and an essential part of the early abolitionist movement. This book will appeal to many different audiences, whether you are a high school or college student, a history teacher or professor, or someone with a general interest in history, African American studies, or women's history. This book is for you. We can all learn from the actions of enslaved women who faced many obstacles, from environmental to legal to physical. Their courage, strength, and fortitude should resonate with everyone. To understand women's lives in and resistance to slavery requires examining their efforts to flee bondage and how symbolically what they wore and carried with them in the process of fleeing were political acts that challenged enslavers' powers. Political acts of resistance, such as flight, and women's thoughts about resistance are in constant dialogue. Although the flight of enslaved women was one of institutional invisibility, in that there was no formal organization, no manifestos, no leaders, no name, the flight of enslaved women constituted a revolutionary social movement in which fugitive women made their political presence felt. In fact, fugitive women displayed a radical consciousness by dispelling the idea that enslaved women could not gain their freedom through subversive actions. This story is an important part of Black women's political history and adds to the discourse of how African American women organized in their communities, protested slavery and segregation, built institutions, and fought for equal access to the ballot. This is a fight that began during the Revolutionary era. The story of Margaret Grant will surprise people. Margaret escaped slavery twice, first in 1770 and again in 1773. In her first escape, she wore men's clothing and sought to conceal her identity by serving as a waiting boy to an escaped English convict servant named John Chambers. So Margaret sought to escape by passing as both white and male, performing fugitivity in a way that Ellen Craft, another escaped slave, would do decades later. Also surprising is the fact that enslaved women not only escaped with their immediate family members, but also in groups without established kin relations. They correctly perceived that their best chances for freedom resided with a British victory and a disruption of the existing social order. I wanted this book to be readable, so one of my strategies was to foreground each chapter with the story of an escaped enslaved woman. I wanted to add as much flavor as I could to the text, so I sprinkled the text with other aspects of their lived experiences, such as what they wore and how they dressed in the process of fleeing, what they took with them, and where they might have gone. I wanted to show the reader the tenacity, skill, and intelligence of these women. My book also directly engages the archival silences to imagine the varied meanings and possibilities that are inherent in the silences within runaway slave advertisements. The goal of this study is to present an American Revolution that reflects the totality of Black women's lived experiences, one that emphasizes the chances taken by Black founding mothers such as Margaret Grant and their important contributions to the cause of liberty. Wherever freedom is cherished, their struggles and sacrifices should be remembered.